Hey everyone, Sam here, otherwise known as FPL Pricey. In today's video, I'll be running through my team selection ahead of Game Week 21 and answering all of the key questions facing all of our teams before the Game Week 21 deadline. Right then, so let's get started by taking a look back at Game Week 20 and how I got on. But before we do, if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, that would be greatly appreciated. It is really helpful, but of course, only if you did enjoy today's content. In the meantime, 70 points from Game Week 20 was enough for about a 50k green arrow, so a pretty good week overall, and that is now 5 green arrows in the last 6 game weeks. So I'm building up a little bit of a head of steam, but of course, it could be better. It's not the best rank in the world just yet, but with 3 free transfers, I've now rolled a couple of times in a row. I'm hoping that I'm on the front foot for game weeks to come. Now, obviously, the key man in game week 20 for me was Brian Mbeumo, scoring 19 points, 2 goals and an assist, and taking the maximum bonus points by quite a margin. Against my own club, Southampton was maybe a little bit bittersweet, but once you knew that we were going to lose the match anyway, at least it was Mbeumo doing the damage in my team. Elsewhere, the only other player that was net positive or majorly net positive for me was João Pedro, who obviously got the penalty goal, which is a big reason as to why I have him in my team at the moment anyway. But of course, that also was bittersweet because it cancelled out my double Arsenal clean sheet with Raya and Gabriel in my starting 11. It was a muted performance overall from my team and my 11. Obviously, the only other returners, Palmer, Isak and Salah, all had effective ownerships so high that they barely did any real benefit to my overall rank. But Mbeumo himself, combined with a bit of João Pedro, was enough for a green arrow. It was looking bigger going into Monday night, but then no Nottingham Forest represented in my starting 11. Chris Wood scoring, and of course the clean sheet for them as well, which now has reasonably good effective ownership across the board, meant that my green arrow went from, I think I was ranked about 400k going into Monday night, ended up 557. It's a green arrow nevertheless, and let me know in the comments below how you got on in Game Week 20 and whether or not you beat my score. Right then, so as always, let's take a look at some of the key issues facing all of our sides ahead of Game Week 21. Now, number 1 and 2, Nicholas Jackson and Trent Alexander-Arnold aren't, of course, injury issues, but they are being sold by a lot of managers, and I do have both of them in my team. So they're 2 players that perhaps I won't focus on too much in this section, but when we get to my team selection later on in the video, I will talk about them more at length as to what my plans are with both of them. But nevertheless, they are being sold by a lot of managers, and I do understand the logic behind selling either of them. I don't think either are hard sells necessarily, but in certain situations, I do completely understand the logic. After that, Luis Diaz is being sold by a lot of managers as well. Now, obviously, the minutes don't look as secure as you would like from quite an expensive asset, and we do see a lot of rotation in that Liverpool forward line outside of Mo Salah, of course. But on his day can be a very explosive asset. So again, I don't think he's a must sell, but given the other players around his price point that are putting their hand up right now, and given the fact that his minutes are a bit dicey and he does get taken off quite early fairly often now, I can understand again why managers would be selling him, but not a hard sell either. Now, moving down to 4 and 5, Gabriel Jesus. Luckily, I recorded this video after the Arsenal-Man United game because not only Gabriel Jesus, but also Timber have both gone off with injuries for Arsenal. Now, Timber's looks maybe a little bit precautionary, but he was putting his hand up and holding his hamstring as he came off. So maybe if you've got him, that is one to look out for before the deadline. With Jesus, obviously he was taken off a lot earlier and it looked like more of a serious injury. So if you do own Jesus, I would be surprised if he's okay to go ahead of Game Week 21, and he's probably looking like a sell. Although we haven't heard anything just yet. Watch out for some Arteta quotes on that. He's usually pretty tight-lipped, so I wouldn't expect miracles there. But Gabriel Jesus does look like a player that you might want to be getting rid of if the injury is anywhere near as serious as it looked at the time. Evanilson is another one that isn't owned by a lot of managers, but it does have repercussions on a few other players. So Evanilson does look like he's going to be out for a pretty extended period of time. And also Unal, the secondary striker at Bournemouth, also looks like he's out for the majority of the rest of the season. So Bournemouth might need to have a bit of a rethink as to who they're putting up front. Now, early suggestions were that that could be Antoine Semenyo, who isn't owned by a lot of managers, but I myself have him and a few out there do still have him. He could play out of position for Bournemouth in that centre forward role for the foreseeable. However, in recent days, Bournemouth have recalled Daniel Jebison, who is a 4.5 million forward, so that might be one to look out for. And he scored and started, I believe, in Bournemouth's FA Cup clash over the weekend. So he'll certainly be a factor. And I'm not sure whether he'll come straight back into the starting lineup, but he will definitely be competition for that centre forward place. So on to transfer targets ahead of game week 21. And one man is dominating it yet again. That is Anthony Gordon, who yet again returned in game week 20. That's 5 in a row now, although only one return per week in the last 5 game weeks. You would hope for 1 or 2 explosions in there, but so far, at the very least, he's being consistent. He also scored in the FA Cup today, so extended that run a little bit. And Newcastle generally do look in very good form right now. Consecutive wins going back quite a long way now. And they do look like a team who are back to their full-flowing attacking best. Obviously, Alexander Isak is in phenomenal form as well, but Isak's ownership is now so high that you're barely getting any benefit from him unless you captain him. More on that later, of course. But if you weren't looking at captaining Isak, if you wanted any benefit from Newcastle assets, maybe adding Anthony Gordon is the way to do so. His attacking data at 0.6 XGI per 90 is brilliant. And he's at a really reasonable price point, around about 7.5 million. By the time you get to this video, he might be a little bit more, but it won't balloon out of control. And you're still looking at a sub 8 million asset going into game week 21, where they've still got good fixtures to come. Wolves at home this game week to kick it off. And he is himself in scintillating form. Another player around the same sort of price point, a little bit more, is Bruno Fernandes. Now, he again is a player that I've got my eye on. And if I didn't have Amad Diallo, who is 4th on this list, by the way, I'd maybe be looking at him a little bit more seriously. I probably wouldn't personally double up on the Man United attack, but given that they have looked a little bit better recently under Amorim, and of course they've got a fantastic fixture in game week 21 as a good starting point to what is now a good set of fixtures over the next 5 or 6 game weeks, Bruno Fernandes and Amad Diallo are going to be very tempting options. Now, when it comes to which one of them should you be buying in or prioritizing, I did a whole video on who to buy a couple of days ago. Do go check that out if you get the chance. And I did an analysis on which of Fernandes or Diallo I'd be prioritizing if I had neither at the moment. Now, obviously, Fernandes comes at 3 million extra, but he also gets 90 minutes and penalties as part of that deal as well. And the underlying attacking data is a little bit better too. So both of them, very good transfer targets ahead of game week 21, but you're going to have to make your mind up as to which one is an easier buy in your position, considering your team structure. After that, Raul Jimenez is also very high on the list right now, a sub 6 million forward with good fixtures to come. And of course, he's now on penalties, got 2 attacking returns in his last game week, and does look like he's back to his very best that we last saw him at maybe back several years ago before that head injury at Wolves. Now, of course, Jimenez himself isn't as secure for minutes as maybe I would like, because Muniz is an option. Now, Muniz himself went off at half-time in the FA Cup with a little bit of a precautionary injury, so perhaps that makes Jimenez a little bit more secure going into the next 2 game weeks, which are fantastic fixtures for Fulham. The fixtures do turn sour a little bit after that, though, so maybe he's a little bit too short-term for me. And given I'm fairly happy with at least 2 of my forwards right now, I wouldn't be necessarily prioritising him as a buy in my team, but your team might look completely different and he might be a better buy for you. Finally, Lewis Hall is probably one of 2 defenders that I'd be targeting this game week. Obviously, Wolves at home is a fantastic fixture for him. And as I mentioned, Newcastle looking absolutely scintillating form too, keeping it very tight at the back. So clean sheets are definitely on the cards for Newcastle assets, and Hall, who is still relatively cheap and good underlying attacking data, looks like a sensible pickup. The other one that I do like the look of is Daniel Munoz over at Crystal Palace. Their defensive data isn't quite as good, but I would say the fixtures are slightly better, and he's got much better goal threat than not only Lewis Hall, but any other defender in the entire game right now. Right then, so on to the captaincy matrix ahead of game week 21. 4 names dominate it once again. Erling Haaland is owned by probably less of you nowadays, but Brentford away from home is still a great opportunity to captain him potentially if you still had him for this long and you've still kept him and kept the faith. The underlying data is good, but obviously there are other assets now that are matching him and beating him. So I don't think he's necessarily a standout option, even with that fixture, considering the others on the table. But of course, he's not owned by that many managers in and around the top ranks now. So if you wanted to go differential when you did have him, then he might be quite an interesting option to go against the crowd. Now, Palmer and Isak are good differential pickups for captaincy, obviously owned by a lot of managers right now, but I don't think we'll be captained by necessarily the majority. There are data-led managers that might be backing Palmer at home to Bournemouth. Obviously, underlying data-wise, 0.83 is still very good, and you do get the extra point for the goal, potentially extra point for a clean sheet over the likes of Isak, who has slightly better data, a better fixture, you would say, against Wolves, but it just takes that little bit extra for him to match the likes of the midfielders for haul potential. Now, Palmer against Bournemouth is obviously a good matchup on paper, but personally, what I've seen from Bournemouth so far this season is they really hold their own against even the strongest Premier League sides. And I don't think they're going to just cave in against Chelsea either, who up until recently looked really, really sharp, but maybe haven't been quite at their best in the last couple of game weeks. And it's just putting me off Palmer ever so slightly. Now, that's not to say he's not a good option this week. It's not to say that he can't do really well against Bournemouth, because he absolutely can. But we're playing the odds here a little bit. And I'm not so confident on the matchup as I would be with Isak if I wanted to back against Mo Salah. Now, Isak, before we come on to Mo Salah, I think is the best option for me if I wanted to challenge Salah this week. It's a great matchup against Wolves. Obviously, Wolves have looked improved under their new manager, but still look very leaky at the back. The underlying attacking data for Isak is incredible, and it's almost all XG. I think 0.72 of it is XG, which is fantastic. And of course, he's on a hot run at the moment. I think 7 game weeks in a row, he's now scored at least 1 goal. And 13 goals so far this season. Again, it's not quite matching the likes of Erling Haaland, but recently at least, he's been the striker in the best form. Wolves is a great match. His ownership will be high, but I don't think too many managers are going to captain him. Maybe a few will take the chance, and it could be an opportunity to go against Mo Salah or Palmer, who I do believe have slightly harder fixtures than Isak does at home to Wolves. Now, on to Mo Salah, who is, of course, in my belief anyway, going to be the highest captain player once again, and in all honesty, will probably be my captain too. Now, it's not the best matchup, it's not the best fixture. Nottingham Forest have been fantastic defensively. Their backline looks really, really strong, especially those 2 centre-backs, Murillo and Milenkovic, and they are keeping it tight in the underlying defensive data as well. 1.1 XGC per 90 is really, really strong, and I think it's only currently being beaten by Arsenal and Liverpool in the league so far this season. So it's a very tough test for Liverpool to break down that defensive line of Nottingham Forest. And of course, so far this season, in the league at least, Nottingham Forest are the only team to have beaten Liverpool. So I'm under no illusions that this is an easy fixture for Mo Salah, but when it comes to Mo Salah, you have to have really strong conviction now that there are players that are stand out miles better than him, because he's so consistent. And in any given game week, if he only gets 1 attack in return, 1 goal, let's say, which is perfectly feasible, he could obviously get much more than that. But because he's been so consistent, I think it would be unlikely that he doesn't get any sort of attack in return, which already raises the bar pretty high for any player to beat him. Now, let's say he gets 1 goal against Nottingham Forest. That usually comes with 2 or 3 bonus points for Mo Salah, because he's so creative, he gets so many shots on target. So let's say he gets 1 goal and 2 bonus, just for argument's sake. That's already looking like a 9-pointer when you include the appearance points, not even the clean sheet point, which may also come. Now, obviously, Isak, Haaland, Palmer can all beat that, but are you that confident that they do comfortably beat 1 attacking return each and therefore outscore Salah, when of course Salah could even haul as well? Now, look, there are opportunities this season to go against Salah. This is definitely a week where if you're chasing and you see an opportunity here, which arguably Isak at home to Wolves is definitely an opportunity, then I say absolutely go for it. But in my personal position, I don't think I'm chasing enough, especially when I don't have enough conviction that I truly believe that someone massively outscores Salah. I don't think it's worth me taking that risk against the crowd when it could do more damage than good in my personal position. Obviously, I'm still chasing myself as well, but I expect Mo Salah to be around about 160, 170% effective ownership. And I do genuinely believe he still gets returns in this game, even against Nottingham Forest. He's been so consistent, and almost every single week so far this season, I think he's only blanked 2 or 3 times. Do I really, truly believe he's going to blank against Nottingham Forest, despite how good they've been? I don't think he does. I think he scores or assists, or possibly both, and I don't think it's the week for me that I want to challenge him, considering the form he's in right now. Isak, if I was to challenge him, would be the player I'd go for. Now, some people might see this as an opportunity. I also do see it as an opportunity potentially, but I don't have strong enough conviction to go against Salah this week when I do still believe he'll score really well. So let's have a quick look at the match projections ahead of Game Week 21. As always, thanks massively to Rob T FPL for letting me use his fantastic graphics. Do go check him out on social media if you get the chance. As always, I'll have a look at some of the highest clean sheet odds, but also the teams that are most likely to get the big hauls. Now, starting off with the clean sheet odds, one team massively stands out. That's Man United at home to Southampton, although that's still only a 44% chance. It's just a pretty low week in terms of the expected clean sheets across the table. 44% is really good, so if you've got Man United defenders, or if you're looking for a defender to bring in, the likes of Mazraoui might be pretty interesting to you. But generally, I'm not really expecting too many Man United clean sheets across the board over the next few game weeks, so that might put me off a little bit. Elsewhere, we're seeing 36% chance for Arsenal at home to Spurs, who are usually really free scoring, but Arsenal double clean sheet in my team would be really nice to see. 36% chance isn't too bad, and that's more telling a story as to how good the Arsenal defence is in terms of the underlying statistics, more than anything to do with Spurs. Elsewhere, another 36% for Newcastle at home to Wolves. Now, if you've got Lewis Hall, obviously he's a very good player to be starting or even buying this game week under that logic. Elsewhere, I think the only other team over, or what, 2 teams over 30% are Liverpool away at Nottingham Forest and Aston Villa away at Everton. In terms of the expected goals, we've got a few teams that are pretty likely to do very well this week. So Newcastle at home to Wolves comes as no surprise, especially if you're looking at piling up on those Newcastle attacking assets. Would look really tempting. Arsenal at home to Spurs as well, over 2 expected goals there. And Man United, no surprises there, at home to Southampton, 2.55 as well. Elsewhere, little highlights there. So Man City away at Brentford and Chelsea at home to Bournemouth all look likely to do pretty well, but not maybe quite as well as the likes of Newcastle, Man United, or Arsenal. Right then, so let's take a look at my team selection ahead of Game Week 21. I'll spend a little bit longer on this section and discuss potential transfers in and out of my side, because by no means is this the perfect side going in to Game Week 21, although I am fairly happy with it. I do have 3 free transfers and a little bit of money in the bank, and I do have options available to me, as well as issues with my starting lineup as well. Now, obviously, double Arsenal defence at home to Spurs on paper might not look the best, but in terms of elsewhere I can go, I think the most likely transfer I'd look at making is Daniel Munoz in for Gabriel, which does save me a little bit of money, so that is tempting, especially because Arsenal haven't really been keeping that many clean sheets recently. But when I look at that pragmatically, Arsenal's defensive data is still really strong. Spurs is probably one of the most difficult games for them to keep a clean sheet in over the next run. And Arsenal defence is more of a long-term play for me anyway. I'm not necessarily expecting clean sheets every single game week, but they do often pull a bit of a surprise. They keep it tight in every game. And as we just saw in the previous section, it's not completely out of the question that they do manage to keep a clean sheet against Spurs. 36% chance according to the bookies. Gabriel as well has great attacking threat, and although Munoz does have the best underlying XG of any defender in the league, Gabriel isn't actually that far off of him. I think it's 0.19 plays 0.14, so I don't think it's a priority sell, even if Munoz does play Leicester and have a good set of game weeks to come. So again, I don't think I really need to force the move there. Elsewhere in my backline, I have Trent away at Nottingham Forest. I said I'd talk about him earlier, so here we are. Now, Trent himself obviously had a shocker in the previous game week, in game week 20 against Man United, one of his worst performances of the season. But as Arne Slot quite correctly said, is the fact that he's had one poor performance and everyone's jumping on him really goes to show how much of a standout performer he usually is. If that's the bar he set himself, that one poor performance leaves him to be absolutely ridiculed by everyone. And to me, at least that says that he is still very, very important to Liverpool. Yes, there's the ongoing contract situation. Yes, there's the transfer rumour with Real Madrid in the picture at the very least. But he started in the FA Cup, and whilst normally that would suggest that there's an issue because you would expect Conor Bradley to, Conor Bradley himself had just come back from an injury, and Slot pre-game said the plan was not to start Bradley because he's just come back from the injury. He's just started the previous game, and we didn't want to maybe put too much time into his legs on the pitch, whereas Trent was a little bit more fresh. Obviously scored the goal, which against Accrington Stanley isn't a massive deal, but it was still a positive performance. Got taken off at 60 minutes to conserve his energy ahead of a big game against Nottingham Forest. And I can only talk from my personal point of view here. I would be very, very surprised if he was benched against Nottingham Forest. He's one of the best defenders, or I suppose attacking defenders in the world. He's probably the best right back in the world. If not, he's certainly in the equation for best right back. And Liverpool, the way they play, looks very different when Conor Bradley's in the starting 11 as opposed to Trent. Trent has been so standout exceptional for them this season as well. The underlying attacking data is really good. Defensively, Liverpool as a unit have gotten really good data, better than even Nottingham Forest so far this season, and only a fraction worse than the league leaders for that regard, Arsenal. So I don't really think there's any massive need for Arne Slot to be changing the starting 11 unless he really, really had to. And as he mentioned, every player is allowed one bad game. Trent is one of the best performers at right back in the world, and I'd be very surprised if he came out of the starting 11. Now, if he did get benched, which obviously is a possibility, it's a possibility for any player ever. If that did happen, then I would probably look at making moves over the next few game weeks to get rid of him, because a big part of why I own him is not only for the decent game weeks to come, but also the fact that a double game week is on the horizon, either in game week 24 or game week 25 for Liverpool. So obviously, if he was a starting risk and we didn't know for sure that he was going to be starting both of those in the double, whichever week it might fall in, then I might need to look at moving him on, maybe solidifying with someone like a Virgil van Dijk, or maybe just removing the Liverpool defender altogether and bringing in an attacker like a Cody Gakpo or a Luis Diaz closer to the time. Trent, for me, though, is a hold. I probably wouldn't be going as far as buying him this week because there is maybe that little doubt, but because I've already got him, there is no way I'm getting rid of him ahead of Nottingham Forest, especially when they're one of the higher chances of a clean sheet in this game week, and they've got good fixtures to come as well as a double game week on the horizon. It just seems like I'm forcing the issue too much, and I'd prefer more information. If he does get dropped, then it obviously changes the equation altogether. Now, moving forwards, because Lewis Hall is obviously a fantastic player to be starting in my defence alongside Gabriel and Trent, in my midfield, I've got two pretty obvious picks of Palmer and Salah. Salah gets the armband, as I discussed in my captaincy section. But elsewhere, Bryan Mbeumo at home to Man City, I think a lot of managers might look at that and think that's not a great fixture for Mbeumo. Obviously, Man City are a great side. They've had their troubles this season, their difficulties, but it's not an easy fixture on paper. I would contest that, in not the sense that it's an easy fixture, but I really like the matchup, and Brentford at home have been phenomenal, barring the Nottingham Forest game where they didn't score. They've scored in every other Premier League game at home. They've hauled in quite a few of them, and Brentford are, I would say, the perfect side to be playing Man City in terms of stylistically. They'll sit tight, they'll maybe soak up as much of the Man City full force attack as they can and try and break at pace in their 3-5-2 with two centre forwards, let's say, playing off of each other and one or two of them breaking when they get the chance. Now, Brian Mbeumo will probably sit as one of those two centre forwards. In the games where they play a 3-4-3, he's usually a little bit out wide, but I would expect a 3-5-2 against stronger opponents, and Yoane Wissa and Brian Mbeumo would be my likely choice for those starting two. I'd be very surprised if it wasn't those two starting up top for Brentford. Mbeumo, with his pace in behind, he's very clinical in front of goal and is massively outperforming his underlying attacking data so far. If he gets even a sniff against Man City, I would not be shocked at all if he buried it. So with that in mind, considering how susceptible Man City are to those fast breaks, especially without Rodri, the amount of big chances they're conceding from fast breaks is way, way up on what it was last season. I actually genuinely really like the matchup for Mbeumo. He's a 90-minute man, he's on penalties, and he will get opportunities to have a run at their high-line Man City defence. So he's going absolutely nowhere for me this week. If I didn't have Mbeumo or Gordon, I'd probably prioritise Gordon because he's got a better little set of fixtures to come. But because I've already got Mbeumo, there's no way I'm getting rid of him for Gordon this game week. Amad Diallo is the fourth midfielder. At the moment, I'm benching Semenyo, but I'll talk about him in just a moment's time. Amad obviously didn't start the game against Arsenal in the Cup. He had a little injury, apparently, that he was struggling with, but came off the bench and looked absolutely electric as always. He looked very, very good and very pacey. Didn't look like he was playing with any sort of injury holding him back, let's say. And Southampton at home is a fantastic fixture, no matter how you cut it. We saw the expected goals in the match projections earlier. Amad Diallo, I would expect to be a very prolific attacker to own going into game week 21 at home to Southampton. Now, there's a small chance that he plays wing back because he has played there before in the Amorim system. But even if that is the case, I still envisage him virtually playing as a right winger, and Southampton will get penned back at times. Amad has even been performing well at wing back anyway. I do have the feeling he'll play in one of the advanced roles in the two number 10s, but even if he didn't, I still wouldn't be worried, and I'm still very happy to own him going into game week 21. I'd have no problem whatsoever with the suggestion he has some sort of little injury holding him back because he came off the bench against Arsenal and looked really good. I'm not even slightly concerned about that at this point in time. Moving into my forward line, I've got Isak, who is absolutely going nowhere. He's my vice captain this week in phenomenal form. Absolutely love owning him. There's a little suggestion that he might have been carrying a little hamstring thing going into the weekend, but it looks like it's very precautionary. I wouldn't be too worried, and I'd absolutely still recommend buying him if I didn't have him already, and he is going to be my vice captain going into game week 21. Outside of that is probably where things get a little bit more interesting for me, and as I've mentioned, I've got 3 free transfers, so by no means am I locked in at this point in time. Now, Jackson himself has been problematic recently, and probably a player that I think if I was maybe in the previous seasons where I could only roll 2 free transfers and would have to burn after that, I might look at potentially moving him on because otherwise I'd be burning a transfer to someone like a Mateta. Now, Mateta himself looks like a pretty good pickup, great fixtures to come, but the underlying attacking data isn't actually anywhere near as good as Jackson's, even though Jackson himself has been very frustrating to watch and own over the last 6 or 7 game weeks. I think it's 1 attacking return in his last 7 now, 1 benching in there, although that was in a midweek fixture, and he is being taken off early between 70 and 80 minutes fairly regularly now. I think from what we can tell from Chelsea fans especially is Jackson himself looks like a player that is very important to the way Chelsea structure their attacks. He leads the line well, even if he's not scoring goals. And I would personally be very surprised if he didn't continue to start games and continue to get chances. And that's one thing that has not been missing from Jackson's game in his recent, maybe a little bit barren spell, is he's still getting the chances. And for me personally, it's only a matter of time until he maybe starts returning once again. Now, Bournemouth, for me, as I mentioned with Palmer earlier, is maybe not my favourite matchup in the world. I think Bournemouth will make it very tough for Chelsea, but they do push up high. Jackson does get in behind those high lines fairly regularly. And I just wonder if selling him this game week might be maybe giving myself one more problem than it's worth and forcing the issue a little bit, considering I can roll another transfer and I can look at it again next week and reassess. Or, of course, there is Jackson at home to Wolves in game week 22, which is a fantastic matchup. So I don't know if it's worth necessarily getting rid of him. given that he's still starting and he's still getting chances. But I do understand why managers are getting rid of him, because it is maybe showing a little bit too much faith in him to come good when there are other strikers out there at cheaper price points that I could look at bringing in. But one thing is for sure, I'm not completely happy with him right now, and all it would take is another poor performance or two for me to really consider getting rid of him, especially ahead of next game week when I don't have Chris Wood and he will be going up against Southampton. So that could be a potential opportunity next week, but this week at home to Bournemouth, I just think I'll give him one more week, possibly two, against Wolves as well if he looks good this week, and maybe reassess with an extra free transfer or two in the future. Now, the big issue right now in my forward line is the guy who's yellow flagged. Of course, it's João Pedro, who had a scan in the midweek, which is never good news. It was on an ankle sprain potentially, but two things have happened since we heard that news. Number one is João Pedro came out and put up a post on X saying that the scan went okay. Now, obviously, players will maybe not necessarily give full context there, and saying that the scan is okay doesn't necessarily mean that he'll be starting against Ipswich in game week 21, but it's obviously a great sign. That obviously means that he's not going to be far away from being okay to play again, but it's down to Hertzler whether or not he wants to throw him straight back into the starting lineup, given that he's just had a little bit of a minor ankle knock, even if it's not quite a sprain. Now, with that in mind, Hertzler has also mentioned that it sounds like good news on João Pedro, although after the match when he gave the update, he wasn't certain and he hadn't spoken directly to the medical team or João Pedro himself, but he'd heard that maybe it was good news. Now, that's enough for me to say that it's worth holding on to João Pedro. Even if he doesn't play or even if he doesn't start, he's not going to be far away from returning by the sounds of it, and I'd be fairly confident that he does play against Ipswich, considering how important he is for Brighton. However, if he didn't play and he was maybe not risked going into game week 21, I do have a pretty decent bench to maybe back me up where a lot of other managers might not. So Semenyo away at Chelsea on paper is not the easiest one, but as I mentioned, I do quite like that matchup for Bournemouth, and they have made it really difficult for some of the best sides in the league this year, gotten points against some of the best, and Semenyo, his attacking data is good, and there's a pretty decent chance that he actually starts centre forward for Bournemouth, considering the injuries to Unal and Evan Nilsson. With that in mind, I think that's enough to give me strong conviction on holding the transfer on João Pedro or Semenyo, who, if João Pedro was definitely out, I would have previously been quite tempted to upgrade Semenyo to an Ismail Assar. But given that Semenyo might be playing out of position up front, and the fact that João Pedro now doesn't look like quite as much of a doubt, I think it's worth maybe rolling the transfer there as well. Now, overall, that brings me to the conclusion that once again, I'm probably going to roll the transfer, giving myself 4 free transfers going into game week 22. And I keep mentioning this, I have this really high bar now on what I consider worthwhile for a transfer, knowing that double game week season is coming and chip season is coming alongside that as well. And because we can roll those transfers, they're going to be really, really precious and give me, hopefully, an advantage when we get to the chip season and the double game weeks, meaning I'm more flexible and I can chase players with higher upside in double game weeks, and maybe covering myself against usage of chips in game weeks where if I didn't have as many free transfers, I wouldn't be able to do so, and I might need to use something like a free hit to cover myself off. If I do have a few free transfers in the bank, it's only going to be an advantage to me later on, and unless I'm really, really unhappy with a player in my starting lineup, I'm not massively tempted to make a move right now. That in mind, because I've got Semenyo and Robinson, that makes the decision a little bit easier for me because I've got a bit of bench strength, and if Trent was to miss out or if Pedro was to miss out, I'm happy enough with my bench coverage to come on and maybe just tie me over for another week and give me more information going into game week 22. Now, as we reach the end of the video, let me know how you're shaping up ahead of the deadline. And if you've got any questions, as always, do feel free to leave them in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And of course, massive good luck in game week 21. I'll see you ahead of game week 22 as we start preparing our sides for yet another deadline.